Samuel Little was more than familiar with the police when they turned up to arrest him at a homeless shelter in Kentucky in September 2012. A career criminal, Little had been breaking the law since he was a child. What started as petty theft and breaking and entering soon escalated to kidnapping, assault, and eventually murder. Like many convicts who began their life of crime when DNA technology was still in its infancy, he could not have predicted that such forensic techniques would lead to his downfall. He was only discovered to be a serial killer when California police took his DNA following a narcotics charge. Before his death, Little confessed to the murder of 93 people over the span of 35 years. But who exactly was Little? And what led him to become one of the most terrifying killers in America? In this documentary, we aim to explore these questions and more as we examine the terrifying case of Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in US history. Samuel Little was born Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1940, in the town of Reynolds, Georgia, about 60 miles south of Atlanta. Back in 1940, Reynolds had a small population of just 871 people, with many of its citizens employed by the local rail yard. Little's mother, Bessie Mae Little, was just 16 at the time of his birth. Some accounts claim that she gave birth to her son while in prison. The writer Gillian Lauren describes in her book, Behold the Monster, Facing America's Most Prolific Serial Killer, which she based on extensive interviews with Little before his death, that Bessie Mae gave birth at home with the help of her own mother. The birth was exhausting and dangerous, and Bessie Mae ultimately gave Little up when he was still a baby. Little was subsequently raised by his paternal grandparents, Henry and Fanny McDowell, in the town of Lorain, Ohio. By all accounts, Bessie Mae and Little's 19-year-old father, Paul McDowell, were never a couple and did not wed before or after Little's birth. Instead, Little was raised believing he was the youngest son of his grandparents. When his biological father returned from war in 1945, he married and had 7 children. Little believed they were his nieces and nephews rather than his half-siblings. Life for Little wasn't easy. Although his grandparents loved him, their own children were mostly grown and they struggled to adapt to caring for a newborn. In his youth, he was often distressed in ill-fitting garments and he spent much of his time hungry. Most of the McDowell children, who he thought were his siblings, didn't take to Little, often treating their own children much better than they did him. In school, he was a poor and uninterested student. While he took up playing trumpet, it was short-lived. He was reportedly keen to play baseball, but never made it to practice on time, and before long, this was a squandered opportunity too. It has been alleged that as a child, Little was sexually abused by an uncle, although it is unclear if this was a one-off or an ongoing issue throughout his childhood. When he was just 8, Little began his criminal career. He started popping the hoods of neighborhood vehicles, removing the batteries and selling them for 75 cents a pop. It was around this time that he developed an interest in the necks of the women and girls around him. He later told investigators that one day while at school, he got his first erection while watching his kindergarten teacher touch her neck. His fetishization of necks soon began to plague him. After his 2012 arrest, Little told law enforcement that he'd once dreamed about killing a classmate who had stroked her neck while poking fun at him. Then, as a teenager, he'd been looking through a true crime magazine when he'd found a photo spread depicting a strangled young woman. He subsequently pinned the photo to his wall and commented that the 18-year-old had a beautiful neck. In early 1954, at the age of 13, Little was sent to the Boys' Industrial School, a reformatory near Lancaster, Ohio, after he was caught stealing a bicycle. He was listed under his grandparents' name, and on his booking card, the whereabouts of his mother were noted to be unknown. At the reform school, students' days were split evenly between learning and manual labour. The children lived in dorm-like cottages rather than cells, with each cottage overseen by older boys and segregated by race. The school described itself as being founded on the idea of the open system. The children lived almost independently and were self-sufficient, cooking with crops grown and harvested on a farm on the property. They made their own meals and learned to sew and mend their own clothing too, and the school offered up some interesting vocational studies, including blacksmithing, carpentry, shoemaking, and tailoring. There were no security guards, only older boys referred to as house parents. Extracurricular activities were available, including boxing and drill team. The goal of the students was to earn a few disciplinary reports as possible and essentially gain points for good behaviour. The better behaved they were, the sooner they could go home. Little, however, soon established himself as a troublemaker. He talked back and got into fights, and was frequently put on farm duty as a result. Teachers quickly realised that the 13-year-old was unmotivated by incentives or threats of consequences. Despite his poor behaviour, he was eventually released at the age of 15, having spent around 19 months at the reform school. It was around this time that he learned of the true identity of his parents, that they were his grandparents, and that Paul was not his older brother, he was his father. After leaving reform school, Little kept on his path of destructive criminal behaviour. Following an incident where he broke into a dry cleaner and stole 2 suits and a hat at the age of 16 in 1957, he was sentenced to 17 months in the Ohio State Reformatory. While here, a fellow inmate helped him train in boxing. He was already 6 feet, and he was fast and strong, intimidating despite not even being an adult yet. He became known as the Machine and the Machine Gun. It was while incarcerated that Little also discovered his interest in art. An inmate asked him to teach him how to fight. In exchange, the inmate would teach Little how to draw. By the time he left prison, he was a promising artist and an up-and-coming fighter. For the next few years, however, Little would see himself having more trouble with the law. He was paroled in 1965 at the age of 25, and upon his release, he took a job at the steel plant in Lorraine with his grandfather, Henry. Though he hated the job, he bit his tongue and bided his time, hoping that his fighting career would soon take off. It didn't. In the meantime, he met a married woman named Jackie Pellerin. Later reflecting on his marriage and his subsequent long-term relationships, Little noted that unlike most women, he would look at women's necks to become sexually aroused, though he stated that eventually he avoided looking at their necks so that he would never hurt the woman he cared about. This reportedly made for a lackluster sex life between Little and Jackie, and with his later girlfriends. In the late 1960s, after assaulting a woman he'd nearly strangled to death, Little and his wife travelled to Miami, Florida, where Bessie May was now living. Once she'd found out her son was in prison, Bessie May had written to Little and offered him a room in the boarding house she managed. But this too was short-lived. They soon returned to Ohio, where Little was still wanted in connection with the assault. The charges were ultimately dismissed, but Jackie was already filing for divorce. Over the next few years, Little adopted a more transient lifestyle. He floated around various states, working menial jobs like a cemetery worker. As he travelled more frequently, he began to have more and more run-ins with the law. He was arrested in 8 states for crimes including driving under the influence, fraud, shoplifting, solicitation, armed robbery, rape, and aggravated assault. By 1975, he had been arrested 26 times in 11 different states. Mary Brosley was 33 years old and a married mother of 2 from Boston, Massachusetts, who was last seen by her family in June 1970 when she told them she was leaving Parma to head back to Boston. In Miami, at a bar on New Year's Eve 1970, she met Little. The pair struck up a conversation and had a few drinks together. She reportedly told Little that she decided to leave her home state because her family had confronted her about her drinking problem. She'd left everything behind, her marriage and her children, looking for something, though she wasn't sure what. Eventually, she agreed to go on a drive with Little. The pair drove up US 27 towards the Everglades and stopped at a secluded area. According to investigators, Mary climbed onto Little's lap and played with a chain around his neck when he suddenly reached out and began strangling her. Once she was dead, he buried her body in a shallow grave. Little would later tell the FBI that this was his first kill. He told one Texas Ranger, "It was like drugs. I came to like it." Mary's body was discovered around 23 days later, though she was not identified until 2017 when dental records returned her name to her. Her death was not immediately classified, but in 1982 her case was refiled and her death was deemed to be a homicide. Little has been dubbed the choke and stroke killer due to the fact that often, after strangling his victims to death, he would masturbate over their bodies. All of Little's victims were women. Many of them were vulnerable, and about 68 of his 93 confessed murder victims were black, though he occasionally killed other races. Some of his victims were sex workers, others drug addicts, or simply people living in poverty. Some had no families to miss them, and several had mental disabilities. At least one of his victims was a transgender woman. A number of his victims are still Jane Does to this day, and the body of many have not yet been recovered. Several months after killing Mary Brosley, Little returned to Cleveland, Ohio. On May 28, 1971, he was arrested for robbing a petrol station, and while still incarcerated in September that year, he was further charged with sodomy and aggravated assault. Notably, Little had been accompanied by his then-girlfriend Lucy Madero during the robbery. She'd witnessed the whole thing and planned to testify against her boyfriend in exchange for a lighter sentence. One woman, Aurelia Jean Dorsey, caught wind of Lucy's plan and decided to let Little know. Though Little had no reason to believe Jean, as he didn't know this woman, he seemed to put stock on what she said, and he soon found out that what she told him was true. Lucy testified against Little at his trial in March 1972, but he was fully prepared thanks to Jean, who reportedly testified on his behalf. He was ultimately found not guilty. Following the trial, Jean and Little became a couple. She was around 27 years older than him, and he described her once as being no beauty, but their relationship, for whatever reason, worked for them. Jean reportedly supported the couple financially by shoplifting and even taught Little how to fence stolen goods. Given that Little was still living a transient lifestyle and couldn't really hold down a proper job for any length of time, fencing was how the couple stayed afloat. Around this time, Fanny McDowell passed away. A year later, in 1973, Bessie May also passed away. Jean stayed with Little until her death in 1988. The pair adopted a routine that worked for them as they travelled around the US. They'd rest in a cheap motel where Little would put Jean to bed before heading out into the dark, ready to carry on with his life of murder. Between 1971 and 1972, Little is believed to have killed a further 4 women. Though they have not been confirmed, Little did confess to and create portraits of some of the victims. In 1971 in Miami, he killed a woman dubbed Linda, who is described as a black female around the age of 22. He subsequently killed a transgender woman around the age of 18, known as Marianne or Marianne. She is believed to have met Little at a bar several times before he offered to drive her home. At home, she discovered that she was out of shaving foam, so Little suggested they go out to buy some. After purchasing a can, he drove Marianne north on Highway 27. He claimed that he drove down towards the Everglades and turned onto a dirt road that led to a swamp or river, and that he dragged her body into the thick, muddy waters. Marianne's body has never been found, and she has still not been identified. Shortly afterwards, Little attacked and killed an unknown black woman who is described as having possibly been affiliated with the Air Force, while in 1972, he killed an unidentified white woman in Prince George's County, Maryland. She was around 20 to 25 years old and possibly from Massachusetts. He was able to provide a sketch of the victim, but her name is still unknown. Of the 93 murders Little confessed to, 60 have been formally connected to him by the police, but he was only charged with 8 when he was arrested in 2012. The first of those 8 murders occurred in October of 1982, when 32-year-old Annie Lee Stewart was strangled by Little in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her body was buried in a wooded area of Grove City. In 1984, he murdered 21-year-old Mary Jo Payton after they met at a bar. Little subsequently took her to a derelict factory where he strangled her and threw her body down a staircase. Her remains were found in July of that year, just a few months after her death. In the summer of 1987, the body of 41-year-old Carol Linda Alford was found in an alley in LA, California. She had been stripped from the waist down and beaten, but her cause of death was strangulation. In August of 1989, Little left the body of 35-year-old Audrey Nelson Everett behind a nightclub in LA. Similarly to Carol Alford, Audrey was nude from the waist down and had been beaten around the head before being strangled. The road burns on her skin suggested she'd been dragged across a rough surface before she died, and her extensive list of injuries included a smashed spinal bone. The following month, the body of 46-year-old Guadalupe Apodaca was found at a derelict auto repair shop after a boy peered in the window and saw the remains. It was determined that her killer had kneeled on her chest and strangled her to death, causing her to have a seizure. Like the previous 2 victims, she was nude from the waist down. The following year, on July 28th, a 30-year-old woman named Zena Marie Jones, who vanished from Memphis, Tennessee at the start of the month, was found dead in Arkansas. Fishermen discovered her body by the Mississippi River. At the time of Little's confession, he claimed Zena was a sex worker around the age of 28 or 29, and that he'd picked her up from a hotel in Memphis. He subsequently strangled her in his car and dropped her over the river in Arkansas. Zena was finally identified in 2022. The last 2 victims whose murders Little was charged with are Rose Evans and Denise Christie Brothers. Rose was 32 when she was murdered in Cleveland in August of 1991. Little had reportedly offered her a lift and strangled her in his vehicle before dumping her body in a lot. Denise, meanwhile, was also 32 and a mother of 2. She was found dead in Odessa, Texas, in February 1994, having been reported missing 1 month earlier. There are also many confessions that Little has made where the victims have yet to be matched to bodies or missing person cases. According to Little, in the autumn of 1982, he met a black woman in New Orleans. She was between 30 and 40 years of age, 5'8" to 5'9", and weighed about 160 pounds. She was wearing a dress with buttons on the front and had medium-length hair. He claimed that they met at a club where she was attending a birthday party and that he'd offered her a lift and she'd accepted. Little recalled that the woman lived with her mother, who was unwell, and she gave Little the keys to her house, though it's unclear why. Little ultimately drove the woman to a wooded area where he killed her and left her body. 2 years later, in LA, Little strangled a black woman described as being short and thick. He subsequently sexually abused the corpse on a service road off the I-10 before dragging her body halfway up the hill and abandoning it. Later in 1984, while driving from Lorain to Cincinnati, Little stated that he encountered a blonde white woman with a hippie appearance. He described her as being about 25 years old, 5'6" to 5'7", and around 130 to 170 pounds. She told Little that she needed a ride to Miami, Florida, where her mother lived. However, in the area of Covington, Kentucky, Little decided to take a dirt road up to the top of a hill, where he strangled the woman in the back seat of his car. He abandoned her body and left the scene. In 1993, he strangled another black woman around the age of 40. He stated she was around 5'5", weighed 110 to 120 pounds, and that she wore a long wig, though her natural hair was short. Little recalled that the woman had a son, between the ages of 19 and 23, and that he strangled her in a motel room in Las Vegas, Nevada. After the murder, he drove to a remote road on the outskirts of the city and rolled her body down a steep slope. Investigators have stated that it's likely her body has never been found. Little claimed that in 1992 or 1994, while in Little Rock, Arkansas, he strangled a 24-year-old black woman. He described her as being between 5'5" and 5'7" and weighing around 200 pounds. He noted that he'd stayed with her for several days and the pair had shoplifted together, and added that her name was possibly Ruth. After killing the woman, he left her body near a cornfield. In the final of these yet unmatched and unconfirmed victims is a white woman Little killed in LA in 1996. He described her as being 5 foot tall, weighing 110 pounds. After murdering her in the bathroom of an empty house, he undressed her and attempted to sexually abuse the corpse, though he was unable to do so. He left her body sitting in the bathtub before fleeing the scene. Following Little's acquittal of the petrol station robbery, he resumed his life of crime. On September the 11th, 1976, a woman went to the door of a home and banged on it repeatedly, pleading for help. She was unclothed below the waist, her hands tied behind her back with an electrical cord. Police were soon called to the scene. The woman, identified as Pamela K. Smith, told officers that she'd been picked up by Little in St. Louis, Missouri, and described a horrific ordeal she'd endured, where he'd choked her from behind using an electrical cord and forced her into his car, where she was beaten unconscious and raped. Little, now 36, was found in his vehicle by officers not far from the scene. His car contained Pamela's jewellery and clothing. He denied raping the woman, claiming that he only beat her, and he was arrested and ultimately found guilty of assault with intent to ravish rape. Despite the conviction, he was given just 3 months in county jail. Modern-day investigators believe Little was likely given a shorter sentence because of Pamela's lifestyle. Her case file noted that she was a heroin addict who was unreliable when due to appear in court. In the early 1980s, things really ramped up for Little, at least in terms of his encounters with the law. In October 1982, a 22-year-old sex worker named Melinda Lepre was found strangled to death shortly after she had gone missing from Pascagoula, Mississippi. She was last seen in September of that year, climbing into a wood-panelled station wagon driven by a man identified by witnesses as Samuel Little. 1 month after Melinda's remains were found, Little was arrested in connection with her murder, as well as the assault of 2 other sex workers. Frustratingly, however, a grand jury declined to indict him. Investigators believe today that 2 things stalled the case. The first was that there was difficulty in determining a precise time of death, while the second was that jurors deemed the witnesses, many of whom were sex workers, to be unreliable. Following his release, though, Little was charged again. He was extradited to Florida after the body of a 26-year-old mentally disabled woman named Patricia Ann Mount was found naked and bruised in a field. Witnesses saw Patricia having a drink with a man they identified as Little, as she was last seen climbing into his car, the same wooded-panelled station wagon witnesses had identified in the Melinda Lepre case. The Gainesville Sun reported that a fibre analyst at the trial testified that hairs found on Patricia's clothing had the same characteristics as head hairs that were taken from Little, but the analyst admitted under cross-examination that it was possible for hairs to be transferred if 2 people bumped together. Much to the disappointment of prosecutors and law enforcement, a jury acquitted Little of Patricia's murder in January of 1984. They had deliberated for just 30 minutes. Little's freedom was temporarily still. By October 1984, he was back in police custody. In San Diego, he was accused of attempting to kill 2 sex workers, snatched off the street by Little just a month apart. Both women were taken to the same derelict dirt lot, assaulted and strangled. The first woman, 22-year-old Lori Barros, was dumped on a pile of trash and left for dead, but she survived. The second woman was found unconscious in the back of Little's car. He was arrested at this time. Though the cases were tried together, the jury never reached a verdict. Little pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of assault with great bodily injury and false imprisonment. Though he was sentenced to 4 years behind bars, he served just 2.5 years and was released on parole in February 1987. He subsequently moved to LA, where he would later confess to murdering at least 10 women, some of which he'd eventually be convicted of, including Carol Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca. In 1991, Little was arrested and charged with aggravated robbery after stealing a pack of cigarettes in Lorain, Ohio, and hitting someone as he attempted to flee the scene. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Between then and 2006, he had various other issues with the law in 7 separate states, including theft, shoplifting, larceny, and drink driving. His final murder came in 2005 when he strangled a woman named Nancy Carol Stevens to death in Tupelo, Mississippi. 2 years later, he was arrested in LA for the possession of cocaine and pleaded guilty. However, he failed to attend a court-ordered rehab program, and so a warrant was issued for his arrest. For years, Little evaded the police, but he was finally traced to a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, in September 2012 after he'd used an ATM at a nearby convenience store. Shortly afterwards, he was extradited to California to face the drug charge he'd fled from. After his arrest on September 5, 2012, Little's DNA was taken. It soon showed that he was linked to the murders of 3 women in LA: Guadalupe Apodaca, Audrey Everett, and Carol Alford. He was charged with these 3 murders on January 7, 2013, though he claimed not to recognize any of the women, even when he was told that his DNA had been collected from their bodies. Before long, investigators announced that Little was being looked at in connection to dozens of murders across the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, which also led to the Melinda Lepre case being reopened and reinvestigated in Pascagoula. After a brief trial, Little was found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Carol Alford, Audrey Everett, and Guadalupe Apodaca, and was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He protested his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him, but there was nowhere for him to run this time. In 2018, Little pleaded guilty to the murder of Denise Christie brothers. The following year, he pleaded guilty to the murders of 4 more women: Annie Stewart, Mary Jo Payton, Rose Evans, and Zena Jones, who was still unidentified at the time. He was given 4 further consecutive life sentences. Little served his sentences at California State Prison in Los Angeles County up until his death on December 30th, 2020. Though no cause of death was made public, it's noted that the serial slayer's health had deteriorated greatly in his last few years in prison. He suffered from diabetes and heart problems, among other issues, and was wheelchair-bound. He was 80 years old. Little maintained his innocence until 2018, just 2 years before his demise, where he became acquainted with a Texas Ranger named James Holland, who was determined to find justice for the families of Little's victims. The law enforcement officer showed the convict kindness and talked to him like he would a friend. They discussed their families and sports, and Holland would bring Little his favourite breakfast when he visited. Holland always referred to Little as Sammy, an affectionate nickname Little's family had given him during childhood. The killer grew to trust the Ranger and subsequently admitted that he'd stopped counting his murders at 84, but noted that there was definitely more after that point. Holland was eventually able to gather 93 confessions from Little over 650 hours of interviews across 18 months. Little also began making portraits of his victims to help investigators identify them. Authorities have noted that Little had a chillingly precise memory of his kills. He was always accurate in describing his victims and able to remember all sorts of details, including mentions of family members, or the clothes they were wearing, or the marks on their bodies, and more. With one police sergeant recalling, "It's scary the clarity he has about certain things after all this time. He remembers names and faces." But law enforcement has also stated that Little never showed signs of regret when discussing his crimes. He treated the murders with a very matter-of-fact approach, and sometimes even laughed about them. At other times, he was also known to speak quickly, with excitement, to the point that authorities struggled to understand his words. He once told Holland that a victim was fighting for her life, and I'm fighting for my pleasure. A cold case detective with the LAPD Tim Marcia, stated, "Believe it or not, you only see evil a few times in your career. Looking into his eyes, I would say that was pure evil." Detectives have described the serial slayer as a charismatic psychopath, stating that he was known to beat his victims before strangling them to death. He punched with such force that when he hit one of his victims in the abdomen, he broke her spine. The prosecution at his initial trial argued that Little was entirely sexually motivated, and many investigators noted that he disliked being called a rapist, claiming that erectile problems made it impossible for him to rape anybody. Still, authorities believed he attempted to, and in some cases did successfully rape some of his victims. LA County Prosecutor Bethany Silverman observed, though, the way he gets sexual gratification is during the strangulation. LAPD Detective Mitzi Roberts told the Star Advertiser in 2013 that part of the reason Little had gotten away with it for so long was because of his transient lifestyle, which meant that he wasn't particularly memorable. Roberts stated, "I don't think he stuck in a lot of people's minds much." Still, it's worth noting that Little's rap sheet is over 100 pages long, detailing crimes in 24 states in the span of 56 years. But despite being arrested almost 100 times, he ultimately served less than 10 years in prison across his lifetime, and every time he was released, he would go right back to carrying out murders. Prosecutor Beth Silverman noted that various agencies around the country dropped the ball on this case, which seemed to be putting it mildly. Little's 93 confessed killings dwarf those of equally infamous serial slayers like Gary Ridgway, Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy. When discussing his murders, Little stated, "I don't think there was another person who did what I like to do. I think I'm the only one in the world, and that's not an honor, that is a curse." It's also undeniable that a large part of why Little was able to keep killing was because of the women he attacked. Black women who were poor, vulnerable, and had no one to miss them, and whose careers and lifestyles were high risk and deemed unworthy of sympathy from the police, jurors, and court system alike. Criminologist Scott Bond noted, "If these women had been wealthy, white female socialites, this would have been the biggest story in the United States. But that's not who he preyed upon." Little seemed to have acknowledged this himself at one point when he was asked how he'd gotten away with his crimes for so long. Referring to the neighborhoods he drove around while looking for victims, where poverty, murder, and substance abuse ran rampant, he responded, "I can go into my world and I do what I want to do. I won't go into your world."